Well, what's interesting about, the story that I tell in the book that I wrote is this transition of, this professional me, but we'll talk about it in third person, right? This professional that goes from living the MBA dream, living the business dream of hard driving success, even to the extent of, hostile takeover and running a turnaround, needing to rejigger an organization, including firing people and all that stuff, and just success. And shareholder value is the only thing that matters. And running business that way. And the book is this transition of like me going away and really questioning a lot of that, both for myself and for others, and reconnecting with things that matters and asking, basic questions, the old saw about, are you working to live or you're living to work? All of that are things that I explore while away, and I continue to explore today. And I do think that paradoxically, in my own life, by changing my way of being in the world, I've actually been able to achieve more and succeed more in a way that's kind of surprising to me, and I think will be surprising to your audience.
I'm Srini Rao, and this is the Unmistakable Creative Podcast, where you get a window into the stories and insights of the most innovative and creative minds who've started movements, built thriving businesses, written best-selling books, and created insanely interesting art. For more, check out our 500-episode archive at unmistakablecreative.com. Ben, welcome to the Unmistakable Creative. Thanks so much for taking the time to join us.
Great. Thank you so much for having me. I'm so happy to be here.
Yeah, it is my pleasure to have you here. So I actually was introduced to you by way of your publisher who told me about your new book, which we will talk about. But what really got my attention was the fact that you are a high-up executive at Take-Two Interactive, and which published Grand Theft Auto, a game that I have played for endless hours and wasted copious amounts of time on and made absolutely no progress on, which I'm sure is probably a very common story for anybody who's played it. But before we get into all of that, I want to start by asking you, what social group were you a part of in high school, and what impact did that end up having on your life and the choices that you've made with your career?
That's an interesting question. I don't get that often. I didn't. First of all, my high school class was really small. There were 40 kids in it, so there wasn't kind of a ton of groupings other than we were there weren't a lot of subsections that were possible for that. But I was kind of in a group that was fairly high achieving for what that small high school in Montreal had, and I was president of the student council, and on what the equivalent of College Bowl and all of that. But I wouldn't say that any of that really impacted kind of the decisions that I made or the path that I took, in a way, because my high school class, I was the only one that left Canada to come to school in the United States. I went to Columbia, and everybody else kind of eventually just followed their own paths and had their own lives. Every now and then throughout my career, I've always looked back and I think back at where I grew up, and it's like, wow, I've come, the distance that I've traveled, not just in space and in time, but just in terms of life experience. And it's been, I often marvel at it. But the experience that I had in high school growing up in Montreal, I think, is so vastly different than the experience that I see my kids having in school in the United States and in New York. Everything seems so competitive and pressured here, but all the kids want to get into a good school, and it's all about college, and it's all about performance. I didn't have any of that when I grew up. I had what I think of just kind of this normal childhood of some combination of work and play and indoors and outdoors, and not a lot of screen distraction, but that everybody has today. In a way, I think of it as a almost an ideal childhood. And in that way, I don't think it really informed my decisions going forward. I mean, I think what really changed my life trajectory was college rather than high school.
Sure.
I don't think that's unusual.
Yeah.
But I think that's kind of the way I think about it.
Right. It's interesting. I've had a handful of people here who went to really, really small high schools. And one of the questions that always comes up is, what did having such a sort of small group of people that you're around in a school, which for most people is typically hundreds of people, have on your impact or have on your, ability to navigate social relationships? Like, what did it teach you about that?
Oh, gosh. I don't know. I got to say, I kind of feel like the thing that taught me the most about social relationships, if you want to go all the way back there,
sure,
is, my mother is a shrink.
Uh-huh.
And so, I grew up with kind of delving into all sorts of emotions and thought processes that most kids don't grow up with.
Mm-hmm.
If anything, that more than anything has really taught me about human empathy and human emotions. Even today still, I have a deep curiosity about other people's lives, and I have a deep curiosity about what's going on inside other people's heads, emotionally, intellectually, and I have a deep curiosity about what's going on in my own head. Mm-hmm. And a lot of my journey has to do with that, of trying to sort out both the inner monologue and finding peace with that, as well as really understanding what it is that makes us all tick, what it is that makes me tick, what it makes other people tick.
Yeah.
And to this day, I'll sit as a manager. I'll sit with people who either I'm mentoring or somehow have a business relationship with, and I'm really curious about the voice inside their heads, about what it's telling them, and how to conquer it. Because a lot of this stuff needs to be conquered. In some ways, it's this ongoing commentary, like the Super Bowl commentary of just like what's going on in your life. There's like this voice that's just kind of commenting on your life. Mm-hmm. The other day, I was kind of walking down the street somewhere. There was nobody on the street, and then somebody behind me, I heard him say something. I heard somebody sort of say, "God, you're so stupid." And I turned around, and it was just him thinking he was alone talking to himself, because something was going on in his head. It just kind of came out of his mouth because, this stream of self-criticism that everybody seems to have just kind of popped out because he thought he was alone. Mm-hmm. And so I kind of have a real interest in all of that. I credit a lot of that to my mother, who always had an interest in human welfare and emotional welfare and mental health.
Yeah. A couple of questions come from that. I think this to me is one of the sort of fundamental things that is actually missing from our education system, because it's so essential to navigating the complexities of being an adult. And yet we teach nothing about it when we're not taught very much about it when we're younger, which is really strange to me. So did you feel that because of that experience, you were equipped to navigate adult life better than other people would be? And also, having had a mother who's a shrink and having been exposed to these ideas, what impact has that had on you as a parent?
Well, first of all, I tell everybody, being the child of a shrink is guaranteed to screw you up for life. So, so that's all of that is true. But I would say, having that exposure, I don't think it gives me advantage or disadvantage. I do have a unique ability, I think, an interest in understanding what's going on inside people's emotional lives. And I totally agree with you that we spend a lot of time in this country, for kids and for adults, focused on physical fitness and almost nothing on mental fitness. And if anybody kind of is at all curious about the mind-body connection, you have to spend, even if you were only curious about physical fitness, you have to spend time on mental fitness, because the brain and the mind is so closely regulate our physical fitness that we need to spend time on it. And I agree, we're not taught the skills, we don't know the skills, and even the skills that we think we know, because everybody thinks they know best. They don't really they're not research based, they're not scientifically based, and even classical psychology is based on Freud and all that stuff. It's based on theories. It's not based on data. Lately, things have been based on data, and we've learned a lot about how the mind works and how the brain works. And unless you're curious about it later in life and either teach yourself or go to somebody or read about it yourself, or somehow, you don't really have the skills. And I think those skills are important not just for individual well-being, but for communal well-being or corporate well-being or any of all that stuff. Mm-hmm. And I do think, from my vantage point, it feels like a bit of a groundswell coming up in the corporate world. But it's probably not. I probably kind of see it because I'm in this world now. But this world of well-being, of mental well-being, in addition to, or the well-being of the mind and the brain, in addition to physical well-being, is becoming a topic. It's becoming a hot topic, and deservedly so, because to date, as you say, we've spent no time focused on it at all.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I've talked to, probably a half a dozen happiness researchers here, all of who say this is actually one of the greatest predictors of your long-term success and well-being.
Well, what's interesting about, the story that I tell in the book that I wrote is this transition of, this professional, me, but we'll talk about it in third person, right? This professional that goes from living the MBA dream, living the business dream of hard driving success, even to the extent of, a hostile takeover, and running a turnaround, needing to rejigger an organization, including firing people and all that stuff, and just success. And shareholder value is the only thing that matters. And running business that way. And the book is this transition of like me going away and really questioning a lot of that, both for myself and for others, and reconnecting with things that matters and asking, basic questions, the old saw about, are you working to live or you're living to work? All of that are things that I explore while away, and I continue to explore today. And I do think that paradoxically, in my own life, by changing my way of being in the world, I've actually been able to achieve more and succeed more in a way that's kind of surprising to me, and I think will be surprising to your audience.
Well, I think it's an interesting paradox at play because, the very things that you abandoned were the things that allowed you to be so successful in the first place.
Yes, there are any number of paradoxes and ironies in my life and in the book. And, one could say, well, let's see how it all turns out. Nobody really knows at the end of the day. Yeah. And everybody's life takes twists and turns. Most of them are unexpected. And how we respond to them is kind of a key measure of success, too. Mm-hmm. And it's also not lost on me that as you grow older, the skills that you need to apply and the person you are changes, right? What you need to do to succeed in the world when you're 25 is different than when you're 45 or 55. Yeah. And who you are emotionally is very different when you're 25 or 45 and 55. And so all of that needs to be taken into account when we think not only about business success, but about life success. Mm-hmm. And so, so in a way I kind of went through a transition. Yeah. But you could argue that all I did was get older.
How did each period of your life, like the before and after, how did your parenting change?
I learned a lot about how I wanted to be in this world by taking time off. I learned a lot about making deliberate choices in our lives, and I learned a lot how to apply different ways of thinking about our lives to live a better life, right? So different mindsets. There's a Stanford psychologist and professor called Carol Dweck, wrote a book called Mindset, which you may know of.
Yep, absolutely.
And that book really spoke to me about how we approach the world changes about how we are in the world and our sense of either growth or stagnancy. So her view of kind of this fixed mindset about just having to succeed as opposed to a growth mindset, which is kind of let's learn. Let's not be the smartest person in the world. Let's be the best learner in the world. And that mindset is something that I really explored in my transition away, and it's changed the way I give advice to my children. And that little voice inside their head, inside everybody's head that says, I can't, I'm not good enough, I'm not smart enough, I'm not fast enough, I'm not whatever enough, is just a voice inside your head. It's just a thought that doesn't need to to be believed. And you can, in your own mind, turn it around and imagine what it would be like if you thought, either I am smart enough, but more importantly, that's not even the right metric, right? Do I want to learn? Do I want to just try something without regard to success or failure? One of the things that I say in my book, because people ask me, why did you write this thing? And, one of them is it was really just an experiment to try something I've never tried before without regard to whether it succeeds or fails, right? Without caring about whether it succeeds or fails. Among the ironies is and here I am kind of publishing a book and yet another achievement. But I do this a lot with my children and try to turn them around, because especially kids in high school that deal with social, things like social rejection or college application rejection and all that, and take it so personally, and develop this, can develop a pessimistic view of the world. And one thing I continue to tell my kids about mindset, right? It's like, you have to turn it around in your mind, right? When you're getting those rejections wherever, and you make it personal. You think it's personal. You think it's permanent. You think it's persistent. When in fact it's there's a lot of randomness in life, and sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't, and sometimes it's you and sometimes it's somebody else. And you're not the center of the world, and the world doesn't revolve around you. And it's just kind of life happening to you, right? And change your mindset, change your point of view, to believe that, A, none of this at the end of the day really matters, and B, that there are forces at work that are just utterly outside of your control, and how you deal with it is more important than the actual results. Mm-hmm. And so this is kind of messages I send to my children. Whether they take it or not, I don't know. Because at the end of the day, a parent is, oftentimes the advice a parent gives is the least well received. Yeah.
Do you ever think that your kids feel like they have really big shoes to fill, given what you've accomplished in your life?
I do think about it. I try not to rush to conclusions. I don't know how they feel about it. If they're like most kids, they will feel a combination of pride on the one hand, and yes, how am I ever going to live up to that? Yeah. And, every kid has that. And by the way, a lot of kids never outgrow it. They grow up into adults still thinking that way. Mm-hmm. And by the way, another lesson I tell my kids, like, whatever strategy you had as a kid growing up to get the attention of your parents, you may find later on in life is not a really great strategy for living in whatever job you're in. So, if your strategy is, I'm just going to keep quiet and wait for my parents to say what's wrong, when you're sitting in a boardroom, the strategy of just keeping silent the whole time isn't necessarily the best path to success. Yeah. So you do need to change your strategies over time. But I don't know how. At the end of the day, I don't know how they're going to respond to it. I assume there's a complexity about it. I wrote the book also in part for them. I didn't think that they would. I wanted them to understand the just choices that I made more than anything else, and that's where the book started. Mm-hmm. But I understood that, sometime in their 20s and 30s, when men and women begin to ask questions about their parents, I thought this book would be a helpful tool to get them inside my head. And even though they're not in their 20s and 30s yet, when they read the book, they thought, wow, it's like so interesting to see that experience through your eyes, because I only experienced it through my eyes, and now I can see it through somebody else's eyes. It's such a bizarre view of it. And I think that's helpful to them. Yeah, definitely. Now, whether they're going to spend their life on a couch, I don't know. But I'm sure they'll blame me for something.
Yeah. So walk me through how you get from Columbia to this really amazing sounding job at Take-Two. Like, what were the significant inflection points that led you there? So I don't know about you, but vacuuming is not one of those things that I ever look forward to doing. But as you know, your environment has a huge impact on your creativity. So I still like it to be clean wherever I'm living and working. But now it doesn't have to be something that you deal with. If you're like me and you grew up in the 80s, you probably fantasized about the day when cleaning your house would be like it was for the Jetsons, meaning you don't have to lift a finger. Well, the good news is that we're already kind of living in that future. And the easiest way to make sure your floors are clean every day is with the iRobot Roomba Robot Vacuum. It cleans up after itself. The Clean Base automatic dirt disposal takes convenience to a new level, automatically empties its own bin into an allergen lock bag that holds 60 days of debris and traps 99% of pollen, mold, and dust mites, so you can forget about vacuuming for months at a time. Let the Roomba clean for you instead. It learns your home, finds dirt, and empties itself on its own. It's got powerful cleaning performance made effortless. Remember, if it's not from iRobot, it's not a Roomba. To learn more, go to irobot.com/unmistakable.
I don't have the kind of career that you can really draw a line through. It's not,
no, anybody who I've interviewed does.
A lot of people, it's just like a lot of people, I feel like a lot of people are very mainstream, and they're kind of, they move from one job to the next, and it always seems to be an improvement.
Yeah.
That has not been my experience. In part, I kind of feel like I've always had to have strategies to work around the system. For some reason, I never felt like I could just do the mainstream thing. So went to Columbia, decided I wanted to keep reading. I had no idea what I wanted to do with my life. I went to graduate school in Oxford to study 19th century history, European history. Got interested in that, in kind of international relations and international affairs, mostly because of the people that I got to know. Decided I wanted to go back to the U.S. and work in international affairs. And so I went to work for the World Bank in Washington, D.C. And that's kind of an interesting story in terms of how I got the job because, again, kind of not having to do things my own way. I just had a friend who worked there, and I said, look, just get me past security, and I'll take it from there, and I'll find a job.
Wow.
And so this woman just sort of like, she met me downstairs, let me in, and then I kind of went through my alumni directory, figured out who was working out there, and I just showed up at their office, and I said, hey, do you need a research analyst? And then, like, in 2 days, I had 3 job offers. It was amazing.
Yeah.
All at the World Bank. Apropos of kind of going out and making deliberate choices and getting what you want. So I went to work for the World Bank, and they, at some point they said, look, if you want a long-term career here, you need a PhD in economics. And I said, it's really not for me. And so I applied to business school and got into Harvard, did that for a little while. And then I decided I wanted to be an entrepreneur. And the 2 pieces of advice that I got from my business school professors that I remember and that I continue to pass on to young professionals today is, A, if you want to be an entrepreneur, I don't think this is the case today because things are differently, but they did say that, A, if you want to be an entrepreneur, don't do it now. Go make your mistakes off of somebody else's back, and learn a little bit before you go off and be an entrepreneur because you'll be much more successful that way. So go learn from an entrepreneur first. 2, if the early years in your career are really important learning years, are habit forming. And if you form bad habits, those are going to last you the rest of your career. And if you form good habits, those will last you the rest of your career. If you form good habits, the only place you can go is down. But if you form bad habits, it's really hard to go up. So go to a place with really high standards. Mm-hmm. And that kind of filter kind of led me to work for Rupert Murdoch at News Corporation. And I had kind of the standard MBA job where you kind of work in corporate for a few years, and then from there they throw you down into one of the operating units and see if you can earn your stripes. And so I did that for a little while, and then decided it was time to turn on the entrepreneur side. And I started a small company, a technology company. I developed a modem. I'm not a technologist, but I'm a tinkerer. Back in the day when computers were just coming online. And built that company, sold it. It's kind of a sideways investment. I think that, some investors did well and some investors went sideways. I didn't lose anybody's money, which I could think of as a victory, especially kind of in the time frame which I did it, which is kind of through a crash of 2001. And then, one of my board directors, who became my partner later, kind of he was leaving his gig at the time, and we were both looking at deals and individually, and we thought, wouldn't it be cool to just do it as a pack and start, just do it as a group, and we formed a company, and that became the beginnings of investment. I don't want to bore your audience with kind of details of all of that, but through developing that firm, we launched what was, I'm told, the first time done in corporate American history, which is launched a takeover of Take-Two Interactive by voting by voting a new board into the company just from the floor by a raise of hands, as opposed to just a proxy fight in the way like a Carl Icahn would do it, where it gets nasty and really make a lot of people unhappy. And we didn't want to do any of that nastiness, but we figured out a way to do it without doing the nastiness, and did it in a way that I think was, good for any number of people that were involved in it that otherwise could have been messy. Yeah. But it was the kind of situation where I went into the company. There wasn't a lot of possibility of figuring out the inner workings of the company before that shareholder meeting. And it was just one day I go to a meeting, we win the vote. The general counsel says, basically, here are the keys, see you in the office tomorrow. And I just parachuted into being the CEO of this company that was troubled, and executed a turnaround that I think today, if you look back at it, it was a company that was worth less than $1 billion at the time. Today worth, I don't know, $13-14 billion.
Wow.
Well, that's a lot. You asked the question.
Yep.
You got a long answer.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I want to talk quite a bit about the turnaround. And I think to me, probably one of the more interesting lessons here is that Grand Theft Auto, in my mind, is a behemoth and a masterwork of a creative project. Like every time I played the game, I just thought, how many people did this take? Like, did you bring in comedians to write the scripts? Like, what is the creative process for something that, is so big of a video game that it outgrosses movies? What does that look like? Like, how does that even come together? I think the guys who really make the game, I was running the company, not making the game, but the guys who make the game, would appreciate it if I, didn't kind of speak outside of turn or kind of give away anything about the inner workings of the company. So with respect, I'm going to kind of defer the question. Okay, fair enough.
Other than to say, the people who make that game are some of the most creative people I've ever worked with.
Yeah.
And these things are super complex. Super creative, right, in terms of what goes into storyline and gameplay and computer graphics, and the list goes on, as opposed to sort of say, recording a song in the studio.
Right.
Both the creative element of it, but just the management of the number of people to put together a project like that is a very sophisticated process. And if you look at the history of video games, I mean, it's really interesting, especially when you compare it to other entertainment genres and other sectors. You can see how, as the complexity moved from having two guys in the garage in the early days of video games to running massive teams to develop massive projects, how development teams that aren't able to make that transition just fall away. And while you could create a great video game with two guys in the garage, there are lots of people that can do that. There aren't a lot of people that can manage teams to do that as well. And in terms of everything that goes into it, just as you said, the music, the graphics, the writing, the storyline, the creative suspense that you build into these games. There's an enormous amount of creative effort that goes into it. It's not easy by any means, and certainly nothing has achieved the success of Grand Theft Auto. Yeah. But they've done nothing but respect for the kind of work that those guys do. Right. Guys and gals.
What did you notice in terms of habits and personality traits of people who are highly creative and highly accomplished in this process, like the people who really kind of stood out?
I don't know. Honestly, I don't know that there is a personality trait. I've seen all sorts of different personality traits in the creative businesses that I've been involved with, anywhere from super disciplined to super creative, and people come up with a million ideas in a second, and people who kind of work through a process, people who are very much creatively driven, and then there are others that are kind of iteratively driven. It's like, let's try something, let's fix it, try it. I mean, especially now when games are online as opposed to just a box set that's shipped, you have the ability to kind of change it in real time. Yeah. So there are a lot of folks that do that, and there are any number of there are any number of entrepreneur personalities or any number of creative personalities. I don't think there is any one personality that can be predictive for super creative output. Yeah, there's I don't know that I could answer the question. I just think there are too many things going on. Yeah, and yeah.
What enables the kind of turnaround that causes you to take a company from being worth $1 billion to $13 billion? How does that happen?
The initial stages of a turnaround is not rocket science if you have the right elements in there, in the sense that, you need to cut costs, you need to focus on the core. Very often their companies doing too many things. You got to cut out kind of the things that are not the number one or number two focus of what the company should be. I mean, you lay out a positioning and strategy. And then, so kind of step number one is really reducing costs to get a business in balance. Oftentimes a turnaround involves a company that is losing money. So you need to do that, and you need to make sure that you're capitalized for the effort. And every situation is different. So I don't want to minimize the amount of hard work there isn't going into that, but fundamentally, at the end of the day, it's a cost reduction exercise, and then B, it's a growth exercise. And oftentimes, the cost reduction exercise is the easier part, and then you got to figure out how to grow the business. And we had a number of specific issues that we needed to deal with at Take-Two, but a turnaround, a video game, I paint as kind of a creative outlet now, and all of this to me is, at the end of the day, it's problem solving. Some problems are more complex than others. You need to know you need to understand where your destination point is, right? You need a kind of a focal point on what you're shooting for, and develop a plan. And there are lots of course corrections between now and then. But all of it is creative problem solving. And when you're dealing with an organization of 2,000 people or more, or kind of just you on a canvas, at the end of the day, it's about problem solving. And I think you need any number of skills to do it. But more importantly than that, you need a team around you that can help. I'm a big believer. We have this thing in our culture of this Superman or Superwoman mentality or belief that I don't know, Steve Jobs or whomever, who kind of is just this leader and this visionary. And Steve Jobs may be an exception. I have found in actuality, there may be a front man or a front woman in front of all this, but there are teams of very talented people all around trying to make this happen. And I'm a big believer, not only that that's the reality, in doing that and empowering people, but also, we talked earlier about, the stories that people tell in their own mind, giving people the latitude to think in that way, right? Not having to believe that, I got to kill it, I got to crush it. It's just all me because it's all depending on me, and it's just not the case, right? You need people around you. You need help, and the best way to do that is to hire the best people to do whatever task you're looking to do. But this notion that there's only one person that can solve the world's problems is a mistake. And so I have found in the stuff that in the work that I have done that having great people on the team is important, and the most important thing a leader can do is deciding who's on the bus and who's off the bus. Yeah. And once you've decided who's on the bus, and you have great people on the bus, you can take that bus and go great places.
You left at what sounded like the height of your career. What prompted that decision?
Well, first of all, nobody knows what the height is until you're looking in the rearview mirror. So we don't know, what the height is. In fact, I think I'm really enjoying what I'm doing now, and I have no idea whether this is higher or lower than that point, and I don't really care, frankly. And there were a lot of things that drove the decision, but the seminal one that I recall is realizing how much it took out of me personally to orchestrate all of that. And I had circled the globe for, 4 years, kind of, and devoted myself to achieving, and I really, really leaned into the machine and gave it all I had. And I remember walking home one day, and my oldest son was barricaded inside his room doing his homework. I cracked his door open and said hello to him. He just kind of gave me a grunt, and then we had dinner together, and he kind of grunted some more at dinner. And I don't know, I just had this realization. It's like, he's going to high school. This is just going to get worse. And then he's going to go to college, and he'll be gone. And in the meantime, I'll have circled the globe another dozen times. And then the moment will have passed, right? And then it's never coming back, never. And I kind of had this now or never moment, this now or never realization. And B, I kind of thought, this is where it happens, right? This is where men become the fathers and husbands they never meant to be, right? You get carried away with your career. You get carried away with whatever it is that's driving your career. And you forget the relationships that matter the most, and you forget what it's really all about. And I just thought that I had a moment in time. I had achieved a certain amount of success. No, not the, I mean, there was plenty more than I wanted to do with my career. But I kind of wondered, what would it be like if I just, borrowed some time from my retirement and took it now while I can enjoy it with my kids and my wife. And, what would that be like? And I began to imagine it. I began to research, people have done that before and all that stuff. And that kind of led me down a path. But there was this moment of realization that if I don't take charge of it, I'm just going to get carried away with the urgencies of work and home. And I don't want to look back and regret it. And I didn't want my kids to think of their father as a guy who had achieved success, but had no relationship with. Mm-hmm. I didn't want to be that guy. So I made a choice.
So I know you spent about a year in Bali, which you write about extensively in the book. I'm wondering how it's made you a different leader after you've come back from that experience and having gone through this experience. How has it changed the way that you lead people?
My answer is not too much different than the way, I parent. I have, I have this odd combination of being very goal-oriented and being very process-oriented and being very people-oriented. And I still am interested in what's going on in people's heads, and I'm really interested in mindset, all kind of mapping against, what are the goals we're trying to achieve. So I still, what I preach a lot, not preach is the wrong word. What I believe a lot in businesses generally as they grow is focus. Focus on what your goals are, focus on what you're trying to achieve. And I believe that you need the right team to get to where you want to get to where you want to go, and I kind of manage in that way. And in terms of differences from where I was before, I have a much greater appreciation for well-being of people and the people around me. I mean, we talked about physical fitness and also kind of mental fitness. And so today, kind of, I meditate daily. I do a lot of yoga. I kind of get centered. I work through management issues and business issues more by responding than by reacting. I kind of feel like I've created a little bit of space in terms of what the world is throwing my way and the way I respond to it. In that space to kind of throw things down, kind of feels like I do these little matrix moves every now and then. Mm-hmm. And that really helps me feel more in control of the situation to the extent, so every now and then situations are uncontrollable. But I do take that moment to, respond as opposed to react. It's a subtle difference. It may not sound like very much, but it does feel like a big difference in my own mind. Mm-hmm.
I want to finish with two last pieces of this, and this is something that you and I were talking about briefly before we officially hit record here. You said to yourself that you published one of the most violent video games on the planet, and yet you followed it up by writing a book about peace and love, which, like you said, your career is full of paradoxes, and I'm curious how you resolve that paradox.
I don't think it needs to be resolved, honestly. Sure. In addition to what you said about Grand Theft Auto, it is also, as you know, one of the most creative products out there in the marketplace. Mm-hmm. It's art. It's gritty art, but art. And all you need to do is look at sales data to know how mainstream it actually is. Right. And when I talk to parents and kids about it, or I used to talk to parents and kids about it, yeah. I'd get two reactions, which is like one from the people that are opposed to it, which is like, what are we teaching our kids? Right. And the other is from the kids themselves, and they look at me, it's like, this is just a video game, right? This is like not real, right? Yeah. And I think this gets lost in the dialogue sometimes. Mm-hmm. So it's like it's a fantasy world, and it's a hugely creative one at that. And so I don't, I know on paper it looks like a paradox, but in reality, I don't see it that way at all. I kind of feel like it's really a super creative enterprise, a super creative franchise. And to me, that should be celebrated. Nothing more than that. Nothing less than that. It should be celebrated.
It's interesting because I think we have two sort of really weird narratives about video games. Either you're a slob who plays video games and you're out of shape. But I think on the flip side of that, you have, people like Jane McGonigal who talk about the positive impact that gaming has had on people. From your vantage point, what have you seen as positive impacts that overall video games have had on kids? I think to engage in that dialogue. Sure. Kind of misses the point, okay, right? I don't think, whether it's positive impact or negative impact, it's not really the point. Do movies have a positive impact or negative impact? When you talk about that, you lose the concept of what that movie was about, what that television show was about, and the experience that you have by getting into it, and the suspension of disbelief that you have by getting into it, and forget about what you get out of it, what you don't, the utility of it, in terms of just the ability to escape and be entertained and be, and interact with a community. All of that is what the game is about. The game is not about, in my opinion, the game is not about, the net positive, the net negative that you get out of it, as opposed to what it is fundamentally. What is the essence of that game? And that essence of the game, if you're playing it and you get enjoyment out of it, I think we don't need to go any further than that. Well, as somebody who plays sports video games and doesn't watch sports at all, I would completely agree.
Right. Well, we're good. We're on the same page.
Yeah, definitely. Well, this has been really interesting. So I have one last question for you, which is how we finish all our interviews at the Unmistakable Creative. What do you think it is that makes somebody or something unmistakable?
What do I think it is that makes it? The truth is, I think, first of all, that everybody has something unmistakable about them, and that we all have a responsibility to share what's unmistakable about us with the rest of the world. And not to do that not only punishes yourself, but punishes the rest of the world. So everybody's got something unmistakable about them and has their own contributions to make. And so that's kind of my overarching answer, that there is no one unmistakable thing. But what is necessary is the freedom and the mindset to share that and allow it to be known in the world, and even if it's subject to criticism, but let it be known, and because you're never going to please everybody. But the worst thing to the world is just to kind of keep it inside and not share it.
Awesome. Well, this has been really, really cool and interesting, and I really appreciate you taking the time to join us and share your story and your insights with the listeners. Where can people find out more about you, your book, and your work?
My book is available on everywhere you can find books on the internet, and in bookstores, and in airports. And in terms of me personally, I have a website called benfederauthor.com.
Awesome. And for everybody listening, we will wrap the show with that. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Unmistakable Creative Podcast. While you were listening, were there any moments you found fascinating, inspiring, instructive, maybe even heartwarming? Can you think of anyone, a friend or a family member who would appreciate this moment? If so, take a second and share today's episode with that one person, because good ideas and messages are meant to be shared.